We're going to start off with slide number 2, so that's the agenda. So we're quickly going to recap through what we talked about last time about customer interviews and customer development. Then we're going to go through some of the reasons of why we actually have software, because I think this is something fundamental that we should understand and be thinking about. We're going to go through some common tools used for developing software, and then we'll do a bit about judging and then about structuring a team. And at the end, we'll just have some more time for Q&A just in case. Let's move on to slide 3 then. So there's just over 3 weeks left for the Tech Under 20 Cup, which is a little bit crazy, but you should be ready to present by March 2nd, which is our final pitch day at Sheridan College. So with that being said, there's probably still a fair amount of work to be done, and don't forget about that. So last time we talked about working with customers, and this is a really, really important thing that most people in school don't learn how to do. We'll be talking about this a little bit more today, but workshop 2 is really critical to understanding how to be successful in the cup. So remember, you're solving people's problems, and you have to focus on finding the right problem to solve. As I mentioned on a previous email, we've made a change to how the charity matching is going to work. Basically now we've suggested a charity for you to contact, but you won't necessarily need to work with them as a customer. Instead, you can find other customers that can be either other youth or other businesses or something to still solve the theme. And within that email, I provided some guidance in terms of questions and sort of a framework in terms of doing a good job in working with your users. And at the end of the day, what you want to be doing is focusing on solving a good problem that people care about. And this involves asking good questions, because if you don't ask good questions, it's tough to figure out what the actual problem is. And lastly, we talked about being creative for your solutions. So that's really important. So if we don't have any more questions, let's move on to this workshop. Slide 4. So why do we have software? So this seems like a little bit of a silly question, but we should start off with the beginning, because software dominates our world and we should understand why. So slide 5. So in this slide, we can imagine a world where we need to create some sort of survey. Say we're creating a survey for the Tech Under 20 Cup. And if we just have one survey, we can write it out on a piece of paper and hand it to our friend and solve it. But now let's say we need to create 10 surveys. And in this context, we can create a survey, hand out to a friend, create it again and again and again. The issue there is we actually are going to be doing a lot of duplicate work, because we'll be just copying out the surveys. So we might get a photocopier to actually do the work for us. Now imagine that we actually have to revise our survey, and suddenly we don't just have 10 people holding the wrong survey, we have 10 revisions that need to be made. So we have to go out, find all these people, correct their surveys, and then get them new copies. So with that in mind, imagine we have to send the survey to many people now. So instead of just sending it to our friends who are close to us, we have to send it somewhere else, say a family member across the country. And now we imagine doing this for 10,000 surveys. And that makes it so much easier to survey people and actually get the data we need. So slide 6. So slide 6 is really about sort of the key reasons of why we use software. So typically we want to make a task simpler to do, so we use software. And this is actually tricky, because initially for getting a task done, sometimes software is more complicated. So ensure that we're using software in the best place possible. Typically we also use software where we want to remove manual and repetitive labor. So in the case of a survey, it's much easier to have a digital copy that we can quickly update and send to people, rather than copy and pasting it or printing it out on paper many times. And the last reason is that typically we want our solution that we're building to scale. So again, rather than repeating labor and sort of dealing with the complexities of managing paper or other resources, we just want a software solution to make it easier. So, slide 7 now. So the way to think about your Tech Under 20 Cup project is you want to use technology to solve your problem in an efficient manner. So this means that you shouldn't be using technology because it's necessarily cool or because it's flashy, but you want to figure out how do you solve the problem you have in the most efficient way possible. And because software is so amazing nowadays, you can really apply it in so many interesting ways. So typically that's why we see a lot of software solutions. But don't neglect finding other solutions to your problem. So technology might be part of the solution. It could be a large part, it can be a small part, but at the end of the day, you need to solve your problem in an efficient manner. So slide 8. So remember that because software has been so rapidly developing in the past 20 years, really, we see all these new possibilities that we get. So with each piece of innovation, suddenly more innovations are available. So when the iPhone came out in 2007 and the App Store came out in 2008, suddenly we were building software for a whole new platform for people who had technology in their hands all the time. So this makes it even more powerful because we have a whole new platform and a whole new set of tools to build by. Moreover, if we think about voice technology, right? There was recently an ad by Google talking about Google Translate being used in real time and how it unlocks possibilities for people to talk to each other, right? So that seems to be science fiction back in the day, and that task could only be accomplished by translators. So with each new piece of software, we unlock new capabilities to build on top of each other. So really try to think about what possibilities you unlock with your solution. So slide 9, really this sort of talks about how you. So again, think about it from both a technology side of your building software, but also the data that you can build with it, right? So one of the issues that we have here in Canada is we don't actually have a lot of data what's going on. So there was a recent report released about how we have data deficiencies in terms of people's healthcare, demographics, financial situations. Basically, we're missing a lot of data, and this limits our ability to actually make decisions. Likewise, in many organizations, charities especially, if you don't have data, you can't make good decisions. So when you're trying to figure out where to put $10,000 of fundraised money, if you don't know where your data is and where it's pointing to, it's not going to be a very good use of that money. So another thing to think about is how does your software allow you to unlock data that allows better decision making? And next slide, slide 11. At the end of the day, you should be thinking about unlocking opportunities for your charity and your target audience. So again, what is your problem? What opportunities does software unlock? That should be your key focus. Not how shiny it is, not how good it looks, but what opportunities you unlock. So that sort of starts off part 1, ends off part 1. Do we have any questions? Okay, so let's move on to part 2. So now part 2 is common software tools. So on slide 13, you'll find sort of 3 main, solution platforms that people typically talk about in technology. So the first one is mobile development, and this is typically the platform we interact most often nowadays because it's so convenient and easy. We have our phone on us all the time, it fits in our pocket. We use it for all sorts of things, whether it's communicating with friends, checking news. It's become a staple of our life. So with that in mind, if you think about your own personal experience, typically you use your phone when you're doing a task that doesn't require too much focus, right? So if you're trying to quickly send an email, message a friend, look up the location of something, you're typically doing a task that doesn't require a lot of concentration. And phones aren't really built for more complicated tasks. So it's a lot harder to make a presentation on a phone or to do some number crunching or to program. So mobile phones and the platforms associated with them are typically for small, short, convenient tasks. The second platform that we usually think about is just web apps. So websites that we go to and sort of productivity apps, right? So if you think about what you do on your computer, it's typically writing up some sort of work, whether it's an essay or a more complicated email, things that require a little bit more attention than what you do on a phone. The larger amount of real estate for your screen also unlocks other capabilities. So it's much better to design some sort of graphic on a computer than it is typically on a phone because you can see more details and typically have more powerful hardware there as well. And the last one that people typically don't think about but is becoming more common is a data solution. So the data part is really not necessarily how you show the user the information. It could be mobile or web, but this is about actually going through the numbers and figuring out what the situation is. And typically when you have a data solution, whether it's organizing data, harnessing data, capturing data, typically you want to do this to help your user figure out what's going on, right? So before you actually go about building something that's mobile or web or whatever other platform, a data solution is actually even more critical. And data requires even more focus to actually understand because data is complicated. So let's get started with mobile development on slide 14. So typically we can categorize mobile development into three main buckets. So the first is prototyping tools that aren't code-based, but typically you do some sort of image generation, so you create a visual, and then you tie it together using some sort of animation. So you can think about PowerPoint, how you can make a small sample app by using buttons. Likewise, you can use tools such as InVision to do that. And these typically are quite simple. You just draw out your solution, link the different slides together, and you have a small prototype. You're quite limited in what you can actually do, but this is quite useful in the early stages of developing a mobile app because you can build it quickly and you can have sort of your main ideas there within the platform. The second thing, or the second level of complexity, is typically using some sort of app developer software. So MIT has this cool tool called MIT App Inventor, which is free to use, and basically what it does is it lets you drag and drop pieces together to do Android or iOS development. And this gives you some more capabilities because the smart people at MIT have found a way to actually translate sort of the code into visual blocks. So this gives you a bit more capability in terms of using a phone's full capabilities, but not as much as if you were at the code level. And then the third sort of level is a hybrid or a native solution. And by hybrid, I mean there are a couple libraries out there now that allow web apps to be ported into mobile apps. So you might have heard of something called PhoneGap or React Native, and those are sort of allow you to write JavaScript and run it on your phone. On the more standard side, you have native app development, whether it's iOS or Android, where you're using tools such as Xcode or Android Studio to do so. So there you typically want to be working on a native app if you have the experience programming and if you want to really harness a lot of the extra capabilities. So on slide 15, we'll find the web development in sort of a similar manner. So we start off with the very simple stuff, typically HTML templates. So a really good way to build sort of a nice website is to find some nice templates online. There are hundreds of them available for free, and basically with a little bit of understanding of HTML, you can go in, change what you need, update your images, update your text, and you can have a functioning website. And with that, that allows you to have something that's been designed by the community and released for that purpose of being used sort of as a template or as a guide. And you can find some really amazing templates out there to sort of be able to digitally showcase what your app's about. The second level of complexity is more of a platform, so you have WordPress. WordPress is a content management system, so people typically use it for writing blogs, but it's really a platform for building websites using drag and drop technologies as well. And the reason I put it as more complicated than HTML, even though it typically doesn't require coding, is that it takes a while to figure out how to set it up, launch it, configure it, which introduces some overhead that you might not necessarily want to deal with for a smaller project. On the third level, we start getting into the more complicated web development, but even more powerful. So if you're building websites with JavaScript framework, such as React or Angular or Vue, you unlock a lot of capabilities by the fact of the power of these libraries. So these libraries are being used by really big tech companies. So for example, React is made by Facebook, and it's open sourced, so there's a bunch of resources on how to use it, and there's a lot of sort of modules pre-built. So for example, if you're going to build a table to show your information in HTML, that would take quite a bit of work to get it to look nice and actually fill in properly. But because there's a large community available for many JavaScript frameworks, you could just basically download that module and then start using it with less overhead. With that in mind, there is a learning curve to getting up to speed with these frameworks. So if you're experienced in programming, this can be a great opportunity to learn. If you're less experienced, by all means, do try to learn something, because that's a core value of the Tech Under 20 Cup, but it might take a little bit more time to get started with that. And then finally, we have a full web app. So the difference between just using a JavaScript framework and building a full web app is that there's typically more work to be done to actually generate the data and sort of store the data that you're creating. So typically when we talk about web development, we divide it up into front end and back end. So front end is typically what the user sees, and you use tools such as React or Angular. And then the back end is creating things called APIs, RESTful APIs, which are touch points for your front end to talk to help retrieve and send data. So for example, if you're creating an app to store reminders, you would build a front end using React, for example, for the user to select what time they want to be reminded, and then maybe enter in a reason. So that's great, but you can't really store that too well on somebody's web page. So for a full working web app, you'd actually send that to the back end where it would store it in a database, and then when you need to retrieve it later, you would get it from the database. So again, that introduces some more complexity, but it enables you to do more things with that. Now going into data analysis. So data analysis is something we often overlook because we don't really talk about it too much in school other than science classes, and even then we do a minimal amount of analysis. So to get started, Excel is really powerful as a tool. There's a bunch of formulas, tutorials, and by Excel I mean either Excel or Google Sheets. So you could actually, if you have survey data that you want to crunch some numbers in, Excel is great to do that. If you want to create some graphs and visualizations, Excel is great to do that. If you want to get a little bit more complicated, you might actually need to find more data rather than having just some data lying around. And as I mentioned, sometimes you can't find the data that you really need to crunch your numbers. So often people have to do something called web scraping, which is basically going through websites and trying to pull out some information from them because of how HTML is structured. So because websites are fairly well structured, you could actually pull out information quite well. So web scraping typically allows you to get information and data that you typically might not be able to. So an example could be you're on a website, and on the website you have a bunch of reviews about, say, a food delivery service. If you were to try to enter that data manually from the website into Excel, that might work fine for 5 reviews, but imagine if you have 2,000, right? And you know that every review starts off in the same way. It has, say, a score out of 5, say 4 stars. It has some text, and it has a title. So if you know that there's a standard format for that, you can write a small program to actually download all those reviews and store it nicely for you, so you could actually do your number crunching more easily. So that's a great tool for when you need to get data online and you don't want to do it manually. And this is not necessarily a replacement tool for Excel. This is more a complement, but you really unlock the power of data by using web scraping. The last thing, again, not necessarily a replacement but a complement, is that there are a lot of tools in the Python programming language for doing data analysis, statistics, and machine learning. So if you're comfortable working with data and you have a good data set, you could do some machine learning or data science, and as a result be able to really find more trends in there than you might with something like Excel. And there are a bunch of modules built in to graph things and do some more analysis, so it's a great opportunity to actually get to the bottom of things using your data. Okay, so that's part 2 about some tools that you can use. Does anybody have any questions? So there are hundreds of tools available online. You can look them up, and again, this isn't meant to be a comprehensive view, but just trying to introduce you to some of the ideas and potential use cases for each of these tools. Actually use your software for more benefits. So for example, if you're making an app to collect people's hunger levels throughout the day, you unlock a whole bunch of new possibilities, right? So with this data that you collect, you can think about who's hungry. You can use this data to communicate to people what you can eat nearby. You can show them recipes. You can show them sort of cooking techniques. There are a lot of ways and a lot of things you can unlock by simply having this base layer of technology. So that's also important to remember for the future, because this information will really allow you to think about what's ahead for your product. So you're not just thinking about what your product does as of now, you're thinking about what it can do in a year, in 3 years, in 5 years, sort of the real solutions you can unlock with this technology.